You're listening to the Second Look Podcast, where we take a closer look at what we're learning each Sunday at Connection Church to help you grow in your walk with Christ. Here are your hosts, Pastor Joe Terreri and Pastor Dan DeRochers.
Welcome to The Second Look. My name is Dan.
And I'm Joe.
And we are here talking about why I believe. But first, hey, Joe.
Good Tuesday morning, Dan.
Good Tuesday to you as well, sir. Joe, we're talking about belief.
Yes.
And so my question for you this morning is, Joe, do you have any firmly held beliefs that are controversial?
Oh, my goodness. I need time to think about this.
While you think about it, I want to tell you about a website that Pastor Tim sent to me called appleratings.com.
Oh, I read that.
The subtitle is, "You've Been Eating Trash."
I really love that website. That was super funny.
This guy...
I'm not sure if there's any foul language on it, so maybe we shouldn't endorse it here.
Maybe we should bleep that. Well, people think we have foul language.
It doesn't have our endorsement, but it is funny.
And this guy has very, very strong opinions about apples. And as I know that you do as well.
Oh, Dan. Yes, you know, some great news. We were off yesterday. That's why we didn't have the podcast out. And I don't know if anyone knows this or not, but my favorite apples that you can buy in a store are currently on sale at Costco, Envy apples. Envy is a sin, but the apples are delicious. And so they're on sale they're on sale at Costco right now.
That was so good.
And honestly, they're the best store-bought apples. They're very good. They're reasonably priced, $4.49 for I think 4 pounds.
Tim, could we get a number on the rating of the Envy apples?
Oh, it's
from
high up there. It's high up there.
Yeah, it's not number one though.
Yeah,
number one is Sweet Tango.
Yeah,
which I've never had.
I've had them. They sell them, I think, at Aldi. There's nothing. They're fine. They're fine.
See, he Cosmic Crisp, which is my current favorite, was a 76.
Oh, see, I feel like Cosmic Crisp just tastes like an eggshell. Like it's like really crispy, like it's really like hard and crunchy, but it has no flavor.
I think it has great. It is tart with a light sweetness. Okay, Envy is an 86.
86.
86.
That's good. That's high up there. Dan, do you think anyone's still listening?
I think we've lost everyone.
Maybe we should talk about the resurrection. Okay.
So your message on Easter Sunday was a wonderful Easter message.
Oh, thanks, Dan.
I don't remember what it was about, but I remember feeling wonderful.
I remember feeling good when it was over.
But
right.
what I
okay.
I heard it when you test preached it on Thursday. And what
test preached. Okay.
What I really appreciated was your methodical approach through the resurrection, and I really feel like you connected with a different group of people or with people in a different way with how you presented. It wasn't an argument for the resurrection. It really was why you believe, and those things are based in fact.
Yeah, I think that, I would call what I did on Sunday more of an apologetic, which is a defense.
We do apologize.
We do apologize for pretty much everything up to this point in the podcast, but an apologetic of the resurrection. And so what you do with apologetics is you make a defense of the faith, and this is something that I think is really helpful for Christians to learn how to do. This is not something I consider that I'm good at by any stretch of the imagination, but it was interesting. I did find on Sunday when I was done preaching, there were quite a few people who talked about how much they appreciated the message, which is abnormal. And so I think that it did connect. But here's what I think the beautiful thing is, and what really actually ministered to me as I was preparing it, is that when you dive into the details of the resurrection, what you realize, and I even am kind of thinking along the same lines as I've been reading through the book of Acts, is what we're doing right now in our Connection Church Bible reading plan. And Luke also wrote that as well, as there's so much historical detail, because I think people so quickly kind of come to the scriptures and they say, oh, this is all made up. This is just sort of oral tradition. This is all kind of legend and myth and this and that. And so you come to the scriptures kind of with this bias against it, like, oh, this is an old book, it's probably made up, it's in the same, realm as the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's like kind of mythology, but it's Jewish mythology or it's Christian mythology. But when you look at what the scripture actually is, and especially the resurrection account, and even when you look in the book of Acts, what you see is historical record.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to say is, and I hope this was clear in my message, that you wouldn't discover if the resurrection was true based on the scientific method. You would discover if the resurrection was true based on the historical method, which is by looking at, history. And so I'm not an expert in historical method by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that what we want to be encouraged by and challenged by is that historical events can be researched instead of just quickly dismissed as, well, this can't be true because it's made up.
And I think you mentioned, certainly in conversation, we've mentioned like anyone who says like Jesus didn't live.
Yeah, like Jesus didn't exist.
Right. That's kind of wild because of all of the extra biblical evidence of his life. Is there also extra biblical evidence historically of the resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, evidence in terms of the fact that it was talked about by people who were anti-Christian. Like, so there was, there's lots of people who lived during the first century who wrote about, first and second century, who wrote about Christians, who wrote about Jesus, called him a magician, called him called his miracles, magic tricks, and things of that nature. And so some of the great source material for that, where you can kind of see it all kind of in one place. There's a book by a guy named J. Warner Wallace called Cold Case Christianity, and he did an investigation. He's a former detective, did an investigation about the resurrection, about first century Christianity, and he has some awesome source material in there from people who were living during the time of Jesus, or maybe even 50 to 100 years later, who talk about the movement of Christianity. And so there is, like, you can see, and then the first century historian Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he wrote extensively about the Christian movement. And all I want to just point out there is Jesus was real. And to say that, oh, I'm not even sure Jesus even existed, means you haven't looked into it even 0.05%. Like, there are people outside of the Bible in the first century talking about a man named Jesus who lived. Now, I'm not saying that proves he was the Son of God. What I am saying is to say that you're not sure if Jesus exists is, I want to say this carefully, incredibly ignorant. Like, that's the best I could say. It's pure ignorance, or it's willful blindness to something that is a historical fact.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. And there are a number of people that you may encounter who just have this feeling, right? They don't want it to be true.
Right.
And will state that as, well, I'm not sure, just out of that basis of I don't want this to be true, and I also don't care enough to look into it.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with a gentleman, it's probably been 10 years at this point, and we were actually here for some reason, and I had some his wife had come to Christ at our church, and he had gone to Harvard, I think, and this was an older man, and he was very smart, and he was probably in his 70s, and he was incredibly angry. He was just angry. I don't know why he was angry. He just seemed angry. And I remember asking him when he told me he thought Christianity was nonsense. I said to him, like, well, have you ever looked into the resurrection? And he's like, no, of course not. I'm like, well, how do you know Christianity is nonsense if you've never done a bit of research? Like, if you claim to be really smart and you think Christianity is nonsense, but you've never looked into it past Life magazine or Time magazine, who do these super unhelpful, unscholarly stories about Jesus and, finding shrouds and this art. It's like, listen, things that make it into pop culture about the life of Jesus usually are unhelpful and have an agenda. And so people form their opinions by things they see on magazine covers in the grocery aisle.
Yeah.
And I would say we wouldn't want anyone making opinions about our whole life seeing us just in the grocery aisle for 5 seconds. Like, we're whole people. There's more to us than that. And in the same way, the life of Jesus has so much to research and look into that if you are truly skeptical or cynical about it, the most intellectually honest thing you can do is at least look into it. Because if it's true that Jesus rose from the dead, and if it's true that Jesus is who he said he is, then just to dismiss it, it actually becomes willful blindness instead of honest intellectual inquiry.
One other thing about the account, you read this account out of Luke, and you've mentioned Acts. Luke's account it's specific, it has details, it has scientific details. Why is that in Luke's account that there's so much specificity in some of the technical things?
Well, Luke wrote the longest gospel. Now, Matthew's 28 chapters, Luke is 24 chapters, but from a pure volume standpoint, Luke wrote the longest gospel. And you can just see as Luke is a medical doctor, and he literally says in the beginning of his gospel that he wrote this gospel, investigated for a man named Theophilus, which means lover of God. And so what we see in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts is a well-researched historical document. Now, want to be clear, in the book of Acts, Luke was actually with the Apostle Paul for much of his ministry. So it goes from him investigating it to him living it in because Luke was friends with Paul. But the details come from the fact that you can see Luke saying, like, he's interviewing witnesses, he's getting firsthand accounts because he really wanted to investigate the man who said he was God.
Wow, that's wild. And here we are, 2,000 years later. You mentioned this in your message, 2,000 years later, 5,700 miles away. And the resurrection of Jesus somehow gathers us together and has an impact on our everyday life.
Yes.
Joe, for someone who might have been or is skeptical, how does the resurrection change your life?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to say that, and I think like being skeptical is okay. Because we're talking about something that has never happened in human history before.
Yeah.
A dead man rose from the grave, literally was in the grave and got out of the grave. That is an unbelievable thing, akin to saying I could fly. I mean, it really is. It's just not, it's very difficult to believe. So to start in a place of skepticism is actually okay, because Jesus' own disciples were skeptical and doubtful that he had risen even when they saw him and he was in the house where they were staying. So the first thing I would say is we can come to Jesus with our doubts and with our skepticism. And yet, what we want to do is we want to move towards Christ. We want to explore, we want to ask questions. And when we come to Jesus and we begin to see that, okay, there are good reasons to believe in the resurrection. And maybe someone gets to the place like I have, like you have, where you're like, yes, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And how that begins to change your life is to say, if Jesus was truthful about his resurrection, then that means he is a man he is the God-man who tells the truth. And so if Jesus tells the truth about who he is, meaning claiming that he is God, calling himself the Son of Man, and by the way, I'm not going to go into this now, but the claim to be the Son of Man is actually a greater claim to be than the Son of God, because the Son of Man was a divine title that we see in a prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. And so when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he is claiming to be God, the grand God of the whole universe, okay? And so what it does is it changes us into worshipers. It changes us into people who see that this man who rose from the dead is truly King of the world, and he has called us to deny ourselves, pick up our crosses, and follow him. And so the first thing the resurrection does is it changes our allegiance from allegiance to the self, allegiance to our own desires, allegiance to our own moral compass, our own set of ethics, our own set of rules, and shifts that allegiance upwards in a vertical way to King Jesus. And then it also gives us hope. Hope that just like Jesus rose, we will rise. And so I think that the resurrection, if it's true, should reorient our whole lives. The whole orbit of our lives becomes Jesus at the center, and everything travels around him.
So in light of that, Joe, you one of my favorite lines from your message was, "You may give your life for something you hope is true, but it would be ridiculous to give your life for something you know to be false." Mm-hmm. For us as followers of Jesus, what does it look like for us to give our lives for something that we know is true, to give our lives to Jesus?
Yeah, I think it comes down to obedience and surrender. And like, if you really want to be happy in life, Dan, like, there's no doubt in my mind, the road to true happiness in life is to follow Jesus. And so when we talk about words like obedience and surrender, they don't normally think of, we don't normally think of like fun and frolic and freedom and this is going to be great and joy and satisfaction. But if Jesus really is king, and he's the kind of king who lays down his life for his followers. And he's the kind of king who shows us the way to humility and to joy and to peace because he demonstrated it with his very life. Like, what we can expect if we're going to follow Jesus is that life is going to not be easy, not always go how we want it to go, but it will be a life filled with satisfaction, with meaning, with purpose, as we surrender to Jesus Christ and we make our lives about his kingdom, and his kingdom is about his authority and his dominion and his leadership over all of who we are. And so we think that true freedom and true happiness comes by marching to the beat of our own drum, and yet Jesus shows us that true freedom and true happiness is living life in a way that is in conformity with his will, and that's through serving others, that's through loving the least of these, that's through saying my life is not about the accumulation of wealth, but the spreading of the gospel. And so there's so much to say about that. I mean, more than I could say in a sentence or two. But we really change perspective and we change how we're living to say, my life is for Christ. And we're going to hear this weekend at Connection Church that your life being for Christ doesn't mean you become a pastor. It doesn't mean you become a missionary. Like, your life being for Christ can happen right in the job in which you work, the family in which you have, the neighborhood in which you live in, because Christ is calling us to be his people right where he's placed us.
There's a lot of joy in that, right?
Yes.
It's not like you're exchanging joy for following Jesus.
No.
There's like so much that's part of it.
Let me even put it this way. You're actually discovering joy by following Jesus. And again, Jesus has not promised us easy and convenient and comfortable lives. But here's the other thing. God is a God who loves to give good gifts to his children. And so every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. That's what James, Jesus' half-brother, says about God, that he loves to give good gifts to his children. So though the Christian life is not always easy, it is filled with joy. God does bless us. He does prosper us at times, and sometimes he asks us to go without. But the truth is that, Paul said it so clearly, whether we have a lot or we have a little, here's the secret of being content. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength, meaning that Christ is life. And serving Christ and knowing Christ is the way to be happy and fulfilled and content in life. And that is something that we learn to do. That is something we grow into. That is something we have to fight for, because the world is always telling us happiness is found in living for yourself. And how many of us have daydreams like, oh, if I had more, I'd really be happy. And I think what the gospel says, you are only as happy as you are in Christ.
Joe, if you were going to name an apple after Jesus, what would it be?
I don't know,
The
Dan.
Jesus Crisp?
No, I don't know. I'll think about that for our next episode.
Great. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
This has been another episode of The Second Look. You can catch this sermon and much more at our website, cometoconnect.com. Have a great week.